You know, it's funny because you were talking about that. One of my favorite writers, always I would read the New York Post, and a guy by the name of Steve Dunleavy, I mean.
I got Steve Dunleavy's story.
Right, which is like, he's like this, I don't know if you're, Andrew, if you're familiar with him, but he's just he was, I don't believe he writes for them. Is he alive?
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I've
I know he doesn't
I've
write
got a
for
Steve Dunleavy story for you.
But he's a person that writes for the New York Post, but he has more talent probably in one finger than most writers would ever dream of, but but in the end of the day, he only wrote for the New York Post. You know, and there's something to be said for that. You know, there's something to be said for, yeah, well, it's great. He could have, imagine what he could have done without the booze.
Let me tell you my Steve Dunleavy story. He was working for Hard Copy. Remember, he was on that tabloid show. This was about 20 years ago. My first book came out. I was on the bestseller list, and he came to Detroit to do a story on my book and the murder story. It was, the name of the book is Masquerade: A True Story of Seduction, Compulsion, and Murder. And
it's a great name.
And he comes out, and I was to meet him at Metro Airport. And he said, "Meet me in the Cheers bar. I'm sure you have one, you know, because they have those Cheers bars and all that.
Chain of them or whatever."
Right. He says, "Meet me in the Cheers bar at 8 a.m. And we'll go from there." So I get to the bar at 8 a.m., and there he is already pouring a tall one. And he says, "Come on and have a drink with me, mate." And I said, "I don't drink." And he looked at me and goes, "Retired champion, did you?" And so I still use that line when people offer me a drink. I say, "No, I retired champion."
That's from Steve Dunleavy. That's
he was a character.
He was a character. But again, it's you know, I'd rather be a working man than a legend, than a
dead legend.
And I think sometimes we do romanticize so much in our society. It's like, you know, I'd go to Red Rock, which is that bar in Hollywood, and the wall is littered. Literally, I think every picture is a dead rocker that died at the age of 27.
Right.
And I don't see the romanticism in that.
But then look, you know, out of that period, I mean, out of my generation, look at Jeff Beck. And Jeff Beck or Ted Nugent, both of them sober, both of them with no drug and alcohol problems. Jeff Beck was just nominated for a Grammy in the rock thing. His latest album is fantastic. He's expanded as a guitar player. So it's an illusion, you know, that you've got to kill yourself to get good.
Right. And the number here is 877-830-830. That's 877-830-830. I was a little weak out of practice with that number.
Right.
A little tongue twisted. You look like death.
I'm not doing all that well. I'm hanging in there now. Yeah, you probably should. Let's take a break and we'll be right back. It's KLEAN Radio.
Welcome back to KLEAN Radio. I'm Judah with my co-host Andrew Spanswick.
Yes, and my illness.
And your illness, your many of illnesses. We've actually, and we're in the studio
too, already tonight.
We're in the studio with Lowell Cauffiel, acclaimed author, and we found out tonight from Lowell, we're discussing sicknesses in the studio, that Lowell, when he gets a flu shot, his teeth feel like he's going to come out.
Yeah, I feel like they're coming around my jaw. I don't do them anymore.
And Andrew has either a cross between typhoid or arsenic poisoning.
Yeah. Now, see, that's a true dope fiend. I didn't say I get a flu shot. I say I do a flu shot.
You do a flu shot. Yes. You don't even let the pharmacist like give it to you. You're like,
no, I want to inject it myself. Yeah.
So you said before you've been sober 26 years.
Right.
That's pretty impressive because look a day over 42.
Well, thank you, Judah.
And so you were quite young when you got sober.
33, 34 years old.
I'm not going to say in those days that was young, but 26 years ago that was young.
Yeah, although at that time that was 1984. So
what a year to get sober.
Yeah, right. But it wasn't like it was in many earlier years where there was just really old guys, and it was kind of weird. But, like Bill Wilson, who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, was 39, which is pretty young when he got sober. So
he just looked older.
Yeah, right.
Because all the pictures we ever see of him are like he's like 68.
Dude, anybody from the 60s on back,
you always look old.
They look old.
Yeah, it's like a Billy Crystal joke. If you you could exchange every Jewish family album. Everybody just looks cold and miserable. They all have a jacket on and look old.
Yeah, I mean Humphrey Bogart looked like he was 50 when he was 30.
Right.
It's a lot of black and white photographs.
Gene Hackman, the same thing. I mean, he's like the last of that. I mean, when he was 30, he looked 80.
Yeah, he's always
he looks younger now.
Yeah,
I haven't seen him in well, not that I've ever seen him personally. But anyways, getting back to you, so you got sober in Detroit.
Yeah, I was working as a newsman at the time. I'd covered the 1980 presidential campaign, a bunch of other stuff, and you know, I mean, the whole drinking thing just started out as something to do after work, and then it, you know, like just about everybody else's story that has gone through this, it just kept escalating and escalating. Then I began doing deep research into various substances from Peru and Bolivia, and was distributing those substances among the journalistic community in Detroit. And I came up with this great idea one day. This is kind of a funny story. I went up to the city editor and I says, you know, there's a lot of middle-class people and upper-class people who are doing cocaine. He goes, really? I says, yeah, you know, doctors, lawyers. I says, I think I can do a story on it. He says, what do you need? I says, you know, pretty good expense account. Says, it cut me loose for a couple of weeks. So I go out and I just interviewed all my friends, you know. But, you know, and gave him anonymity in his story. And
Right.
at the end of all the research, I had all the human element. I said, well, I ought to get the police angle on this. So I decided to go on a raid with the head of the narcotics division of the Detroit Police Department, right? And so we go busting into this biker's house with the ram and the whole thing, and they tear apart this guy's house, and they cut open his couch, you know, with razor blades. They're looking for the dope, and it's just this huge, monstrous, like, raid scene, right?
Right.
Just like out of the movies. And Inspector Dwyer, who was the head of narcotics at the time, goes, all right, Cauffiel, come in here. Let me show you what we're looking for. And out of the cookie jar, he pulls like just 2 grams of coke. He says, this is what we're looking for. And I thought, shit, we could have gone to my house. We could have gone to my house and had a much better. You're gonna have to bleep that.
Yes.
I think the engineer missed it.
I think the engineer is on a dump.
Well, I thought we could have gone to my house and had a much better raid, you know, because what I was holding at the time was way beyond.
So you really organized your whole life around drinking and using,
right?
Like literally, almost. It sounds like every single thing you wrote. You know, you created stories. But
you know, here's what the interesting thing that happened. Excuse me, is that I got off any of the illegal substances,
right?
And I thought that then my drinking would just like return to back to social level. And it didn't. And so there was a couple of more years of just, you know, solid alcohol. And then I just reached this point where, you know, I'm writing stories with front page bylines like busting people for, you know, unethical behavior and stuff like that, but living a double life at the same time. I thought, God, if anybody wrote a story on me, they'd just, you know, it would be a hell of a story. And I reached that I just didn't recognize myself anymore, and ended up going to one of the guys in the newsroom that was sober and said, you know, I need some help. But I never went through treatment. You know, I've done it all with, you know, support groups, and have been you know, clean and sober ever since.
So you're one of those rare few that made a decision and stuck to it.
Yeah, and it was an ugly bottom. I mean, I had nothing left, and but I never lost my job. I never crashed a car. I crashed an airplane.
Whoa.
You know.
What do you mean you crashed an airplane?
I'd had a couple of 6-packs of beer and gotten an ultralight airplane, and the guy said you can taxi it around on the runway, you know, but don't take off. And I decided
you're going to try and fly.
Yeah, so I took off. Next thing I know, I'm like 20 feet in there, and I'm going, what am I doing?
That's when you realize you're not a pilot.
Yeah.
Like you might have told tons of stories where you were, but that's when you're actually in the air going, wait, that story where I was a commander in the Air Force? Not true.
Right. So I let off the throttle, and it nosedived, and I'm lucky I wasn't decapitated by the propeller. It was, you know, there were a lot of those kind of close calls. So.
And that was it.
Yeah. And you know, then began the journey of recovery, which is a long and ongoing, you know, journey. The interesting thing to me about addiction and alcoholism is there's this myth that it's the drugs and alcohol that cause all the problems. Yeah, they cause problems, but I like to say that for the drug addict or the alcoholic, the problem isn't drugs or alcohol. The problem is the lack of drugs and alcohol, because every time I tried to clean up or get sober, I eventually got faced with that sort of irritable, restless, discontent self, and that's what always sent me back. And to me, that's, you know, where support groups come in, and getting, you know, the kind of proper treatment comes in, is that you have to learn to get through life without medicating yourself.
How many times did you try and get sober before it actually stuck?
I had one 5-day break 1 year before my last binge. My last binge lasted a year. Right. So from the first time I actively sought help from an outside source, through support groups, I've been sober ever since.
And then after you
I didn't have, and I let other people relapse for me. I mean, whenever I see somebody relapse, I go up and thank them. I say, hey, thanks for doing some homework.
I'm sure they must love you.
Yeah, they do. I love doing it, though.
It's interesting, though, because you talked about how, for you, sort of the testing was that you stopped using illicit drugs, and then you found that you became worse of an alcoholic, or the alcoholism progressed onward. So you kind of tested yourself before you got sober, whether or not you could get sober in a way.
Yeah, well, the other big myth is that it's the substance that somehow determines your addiction. No, it's you that determine your addiction. Right. You try. For me, it was finding a way to feel complete and feel whole, and whatever it took to do that. And it was illegal substances for a while, and I thought, well, that's the problem. Or pot's the problem, or coke's the problem, or Valium is the problem. Alcohol's not the problem, but the problem was Lowell.
Right.
That's where the problem is, and so it's like you have a furnace, and anything that burns in it will work. So, it's so funny before you get sober and before you clean up, what you think being clean or sober is. We have no conception of what it's like on the other side, other than to try to go dry,
right.
Which is
I often hear so much from people that have been alcoholics or are alcoholics, and they get sober, and they just can't believe that nobody else is drinking once they get sober. Like, they just think that when you're drinking, you assume everybody always drinks around you.
I didn't trust anybody that didn't drink.
Really?
I mean, I would not. I said there's something wrong with them. Yeah.
Mike Tyson said that. He said, if you wouldn't drink with me, I won't sign a contract with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, he was an alcoholic.
And he lost all his money.
And
it might not be the best guy to trust. But our heads are crazy, because I remember when I got sober, I was walking around New York, right? And I believe it was probably Thanksgiving or Christmas or one of those. And I remember every time I would look at somebody, I would go, my God, they got to drink for 4 days straight. Like, I was jealous that I thought everybody in New York City was drinking for 4 days straight, and like they got a 4-day work, they got a 4-day, and that's all I could think. Because my thinking was so at that point off.
Right.
Yeah.
We
really create off thinking for ourselves.
Well, our sense of perception is just completely blown out.
I actually feel good enough today that I can get loaded.
Well, I got sober on December 3rd, 1984, and Christmas was only 21 days away. And I remember the Christmas party for the family, and people were leaving half glasses of wine around. And I said, "Aren't you going to drink that?" And they go, "No, I'm done." And I'm thinking, why are you even drinking? I couldn't understand somebody leaving a half glass of wine. I can't leave a bottle of water today still. I got to finish a cup of coffee.
Right.
I mean, it's just,
and I guzzle it. I mean, there's no moderation with anything I drink. I was walking around Manhattan also with my friend Tony, and I remember looking into a bar, and I go, and he was a Brooklyn guy, and I go, oh my God, Tony, if only I was drinking. And I see these hot women inside. I go, if only I was drinking. He goes, what? You wouldn't get them either. He goes, I've heard your story, Judah. You weren't exactly Don Juan. And it was so funny because I needed to hear somebody say that to me, because we could romanticize things that never actually occurred. Which is fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, too, is that everything that I was looking for out of drugs and alcohol, I've achieved in sobriety, that missing piece. And it did work for a long time. I mean, I actually finally remember my good drinking days and the fun that I had in that. I don't have this aversion where I think negatively about all that. But, it goes through those 3 stages, the fun stage, fun and trouble stage, and the all trouble stage. I mean, they revoked my license to fun with it.